Welcome to the Battles We Pick podcast, where advocates and organizers talk about their work pushing for social, political, and policy change. Today's guest is Gawain Kripke, founding partner of Double Dogwood, where he devises strategies and solutions for nonprofits and philanthropies. Gawain spent the bulk of his career with Oxfam America, most of that time as policy director responsible for the organization's advocacy efforts. In our conversation, he raised a number of important questions about the challenges of seeking change and justice with our country's political system in such a badly broken state. Here in the early phase of this pretty new podcast, the guests are all people I know. So I'm starting off each episode by saying how I know them. And I'll do that until I run out of people I know. I met Gawain Kripke about 10 years ago when I was working with Sophia Murphy, who'd also be a good guest, come to think of it. Sophia and I were looking for the right food security issues that would be well suited to the G20 summit process. Gawain was at Oxfam back then, as he was for much of his career. Recently, he was elected to the Advisory Neighborhood Commission for his neighborhood in Northwest Washington, D.C., someone with an international policy background running for local office, a man after my own heart. Thanks so much for doing this, and I guess I should say welcome, Commissioner Kripke.
Thank you. I'm getting comfortable with the honorific.
People should definitely use that in meetings, even if not in other contexts. Anyway, I digress. I confessed on an earlier episode that I do pre-interviews, and I want to start with a really interesting point you made in our pre-interview about high-quality leaders. You said that sometimes when deciding on the focus of your advocacy, in other words, picking your battle, the smart move is simply to take a cue from a wise and savvy leader. Talk more about that, if you would.
Yeah. The observation is how important leadership is to advancing a policy agenda, and that if you don't have good leadership, it's extremely hard to advance a policy agenda. To me, politics is some kind of balance between ideology and opportunity. And I think as an advocate, I've often spent too much time worrying about what I think and less time analyzing what the opportunity is and lunging into the opportunities when they emerge. And looking back on a couple decades of work, I realized we missed big opportunities by not rallying around leaders when they wanted to do things. And sometimes leaders wanted to do things and got them done even without our support. So I look especially at sort of the environmental field and the international development, human rights field as case studies in this, and feel like we don't invest enough credit and rally around leadership when it emerges. Instead, we put our own priorities forward.
Are you making a broad point about, does this apply to both insiders who hold office and are decision makers and outside advocates?
I'm
referring more one than the other.
More decision makers, more people within government or within politics than outside leaders. That's what I'm talking about. People who are in a position to actually do things or make things happen. And I mean, one example, I was thinking this morning on this question, and this is going to age me, but I was around when Bill Clinton and Al Gore came into office. And in their first big budget fight, they proposed a huge budget that was meant to reduce a deficit, which reminds me of something recently, but yes, also make some big changes. And Al Gore really insisted at that time that to include in that budget package a very small carbon tax. And I was working for an environmental group at the time. And we're talking the early 90s, and a carbon tax was like an obscure idea at the time. And most of the environmental community basically ignored it. And looking back now, 30 years later, what if we had instituted a carbon tax in the early 90s? Wouldn't
Right.
our climate policy situation be much different? And shouldn't we have rallied around that in a much bigger way than we did at the time to try to get that carbon tax instituted? We didn't. We failed, and we've, I think, suffered ever since.
What have you noticed anything else about what those, I guess we call them champions, right? The allies in decision-making roles, what they see that that we don't, aside from the obvious that they're insiders, but have you had any other observations about what that is, about how that works, and what kind of what they're seeing and how they're making their assessments?
Well, one of the things that comes clear is that there's a huge apparatus of policy analysis and think tanks and position papers and advocacy organizations and membership organizations, all of which has a kind of tentative connection to the electoral process. That's structurally required. Nonprofits can't engage in electoral activities. They have to keep these bright lines between them. And yet, when you're looking at the incentives and needs of elected officials, a lot of times there's a real mismatch and a disconnect between what advocacy organizations, especially sort of on the nonprofit or progressive side, are seeking and what the calculus is for elected officials. And I think trying to integrate those analyses a bit closer is an important thing to try to do. And when a political leader says, I want to do this, they're either making some kind of personal stand or an electoral calculus that's important to listen to. And sometimes I feel like we don't listen to our leaders carefully enough.
I ran across this great Lawrence Friedman quote recently that said, don't be too hard on the politicians. After all, they're the ones that have to explain it to the public. And I think
Exactly.
he was making a reference actually to climate action and the climate crisis. I have clear memories of a close friend advising me, this is exactly about the difference between politicians and those who are not. Leave the politics to the politicians, right? And of course, it's sort of famous in the national security world when presidents say, leave the politics to me. I mean, that can't be completely right because anything that's controversial, anything we're trying to do is political, and so surely we have to take that into consideration as best we can. But yeah, I think you're right. It's unique or particular to the politician's role to be factoring in sort of the public view and how it's all going to look or sound.
Right. And there's the experience of like door knocking, which David, you and I have both done recently, which is a real revelation about how people think of issues when you try out some of your ideas on somebody you just met on their doorstep and say, what do you think of climate change, or what do you think of paid leave, or taxes on the wealthy, or any of the issues that you might want to be pushing, and hear back what the impression is. It's sometimes very surprising what people actually think. Sometimes much more radical than you would think, and or just different than you might imagine what what people are really thinking. So I strongly encourage people early in their careers, especially, but all through their careers, to go knock on doors, to go volunteer for campaigns and talk to real people at their doors and see what they think.
Well, just take your neighborhood. Are there issues that sort of have a level of salience that have been talked about a lot? Maybe been controversial in the neighborhood, or views of something in the District of Columbia more broadly, and how people locally feel about it. So that's more what I had in mind in terms of people having a connection to an ongoing conversation.
Yeah, well, my observation there. So you and I both. I'm like at the microscopic level of politics, but I knocked on a couple hundred doors in the fall to get elected to my tiny little position. It's unpaid, but my observation in that was that most people are pretty reasonable. They might have an opinion, but they don't feel that strongly, and they're willing to discuss it. This is on local issues, and there may be a lot more flexibility at sort of a local level rather than at a higher national and ideological level. But the interesting thing is that the biggest reflection of temperature is local media, and especially like neighborhood listservs, where the discourse is highly inflamed and highly polarized, and which until I started knocking on doors, I thought that reflected the neighborhood. And then as I knocked on doors, I realized that actually isn't what the overwhelming majority of people I'm talking to actually feel. It's just extremely misrepresented in the media. In Washington's case, the Washington Post is the main, and local news stations, and then also on the neighborhood lists. So I found it kind of reassuring that people actually weren't that polarized. They were interested. Number one, they're friendly and willing to just have a discussion. That was my experience at an extremely local level, knocking on doors around my neighborhood. There are a couple of polarized issues, but it wasn't really reflected in my actual neighbors.
That point is so important, and there are two things going on. I think that structurally, like, one of the key characteristics of local government is it meets every month, right? Every month, things are being discussed and decided. It's not like a legislative season in state legislatures, or precious days in session in Congress. I think that makes a huge difference, including what you're talking about. That there's a sometimes very loud discussion of issues that raise controversy, and that sort of has to be dealt with somehow, because it's taking place, and the give and take there. And then there's much quieter. The actual sentiments, just like you're saying, aren't always in line with that sense of controversy. But I should disclose, not for ethical reasons necessarily, but just to say that what we share a sort of not only an urbanist orientation, but we're both big bike and pedestrian friendliness advocates, and you've been kind enough to support my own political campaigns, which I guess I want to thank you publicly.
You're welcome. I'm glad you won.
Thanks. So the other thing that you shared in some of the prep that we did for this conversation was that you're having a nagging sense that we're doing in really broad terms, as a field, advocacy is doing it wrong or getting some big things wrong. What's been on your mind there?
Well, I have a bunch of floating ideas, and I don't have a comprehensive hypothesis yet. But my thought is that politics have changed. They've become more polarized. The parties have become more consolidated in terms of their ideologies. You have a lot less overlap between the political parties, and therefore less deal making or coalitions to be made, intra-party coalitions, and uh, and yet a lot of our sort of political hypothesis is around bipartisanship and finding the middles or the common ground, which I'm not disavowing. I'm just not sure it really works that well anymore. And I I saw less and less of it happen in the course of my own career. Less and less ability to build bipartisan coalitions, less ability to have dissidents work within parties, either Republican or Democrat, working sort of against the mainstream of their parties uh, in a good faith and even civil way, and also and relatedly is that our actual sort of legislative and policy processes are very broken. The budget process, if you want to call it that, is just is really broken, like at the federal level. And we keep having these terrible breakdowns with government shutdowns or crises that we're just doing right now. And um, there's a process in place that rarely works, actually. I mean, it's more the exception than the rule that appropriations and budgets pass, on time and in regular order. More usually there's some kind of meltdown at the end of a year where the sausage is made. And that raises the question, like, if you can't use a regular process to really achieve policy goals, then do you have a strategy around the sausage making, which is a lot of insider access, lobbyists and so forth. Um, that's how. So I I see the process doesn't work well. The ability to build and work within bipartisan strategies is not work. It doesn't work as well as it has in the past. Maybe rarely works anymore. And I'm not sure we are using the right tools. I think probably we need to experiment, but it might mean work like being more comfortable being more partisan. That's one hypothesis. It might mean trying to work within party processes and insider processes more rather than having sort of outsider advocacy and campaigns running because maybe they don't work anymore. And um, and I think the sort of populist or democratic function of advocacy is at risk. I think it's at risk of becoming even more insider and lobbyist based than it has been in the past. So those are just some thoughts, but I do think we need to be talk about this and trying to innovate around it.
But I think the question you're raising, sort of says that we're not even setting ourselves up for achievable larger change, but for the time being, really kind of trying to squeeze as many small things as we can out. Does that sound right? At least in terms of how I'm understanding you?
I think that might be right, which I regret to say. And I don't like uh, I don't give up the idea of bigger change, more transformative change, but I'm not sure how we get there. And I think maybe those transformations have to happen through incremental, small nudges along the way rather than through more thoroughgoing um, revolutions. And so again, these are hypotheses, and I'm struggling with this as I go. But the reason I'm thinking about it is because I feel like a lot of advocacy strategies that I observe are likely to fail because they rely on notions of how politics work that aren't really true or aren't very true. Yeah.
I can't actually think of one counterexample that says that maybe not to give up quite to that extent. Of course, we absolutely should face the realities that confront us. But so the first gun safety legislation in a long time passed, which it was limited, obviously, but it kind of broke the dam or whatever the metaphor is. But that's the kind of example that says you keep at it, you look for that moment, be ready when it arrives, and you start to turn things around by getting something when there's been nothing for a really long time.
Yeah, you think that's a counterexample? I think that's an example of how broken the system is, how sort of overwhelming public majorities support change, and yet the political system has resisted change. And through the continual murder of children and civilians in our society, there was finally enough pressure to do very small incremental changes to gun policy. So I don't think that disproves the case. In fact, maybe it's evidence for the case.
It's unfamiliar to be the optimist in any conversation, I have to say. So I don't disagree with anything you just said, but I'm talking myself into sticking on the position that you would know better than I do how hard it is to get something through Congress. And that's kind of essential to what I'm saying here, that almost, so little gets through at all. There's been nothing on the subject. Importantly, there's an opposition at work, the NRA, who insists that there be nothing. So I think I do think it's significant for something to pass over and against their objections. Similar, I guess, to what's going on in the States, and of course that shifting to other levels of government is one path. And I completely agree with you about the problem of bipartisanship in a time when one of the parties has lost its mind. But our system is bipartisan. On the other hand, I guess we have an observable pattern, I suppose, right? That significant things happen under democratic control. Which is an argument, absolutely, for focusing on who gets into office.
I think so. I think that's sort of my observation, is that gridlock has gotten worse. The inertia of the system, the veto power of the veto power that is held by many different stakeholders locks up the system unless you have one party control. I don't want that to be true, and I kind of am still hoping it's not totally true. And yet, you don't see much change of significance unless one party has control. Thus, so far, or you're in a crisis. I mean, it is true that under the pandemic, you saw some pretty big stuff happen, And when wars happen, when Russia invades Ukraine, you can see big resources and even some policies change. So crises do create opportunities and do drive change. And so that's the other strategy, is just be patient until something disastrous happens and then lunge into it.
I'm really interested in how incremental, patiently paced change can be complementary to more ambitious transformation. I often wonder if we need to treat this as either or.
Mm-hmm.
That incremental change, is there a way to pursue it that is mindful of getting more over time?
Yes, I think that is an interesting area of inquiry, is how to make them complementary. And I think implied in what you're saying is that there's this weird time horizon in thinking about incremental change and then big change, a little, and then a lot. But that doesn't happen in a 1, 2, or even maybe a 4-year cycle. It might happen in an 8-year cycle, where you get a little bit over 8 years and then a lot at the end of it. And for strategists and for funders of strategies, that's hard, because it's very hard to be thinking in terms of 10-year strategy to get something done. And yet I think most of the time horizons that we develop strategies for, which is usually 2 or maybe 4 years, is just way too small or way too short to be realistic within our political system. So that's another thing, is like, no one wants to be working on anything for 10 years. And yet I think realistically you have to have sort of a 10-year horizon to get big changes.
I think the narrative level might be a key piece here. And the example that you gave points toward it, I think. So yes, the COVID response bills were stimulus at, just think back to the financial crisis and how the Obama team felt like, it needed to be kept under $1 trillion.
Mm-hmm.
Until it needed to be kept under $1 trillion until it didn't, right? Mm-hmm. That's a significant change. And I often think of the Occupy movement.
Mm-hmm.
And critique is often made of the Occupy movement that it didn't. It was so up at 30,000 feet that it didn't have an agenda for accomplishing concrete changes. I had a completely different response to the Occupy movement. You and I both have been around long enough to know that economic inequality just wasn't allowed to be discussed. It was kind of kept away from the discussion.
Mm-hmm.
Because the right wing would just say class warfare, can't promise equal outcomes, just equal opportunity, right? And Occupy, particularly with the idea of the 99% and the 1%, they broke that taboo. That's just gone, right?
Mm-hmm.
So an entire subject, an important justice lens, now could be looked at. Now could be part of the definition of the problems. Mm-hmm. So all of that just to make that point that maybe a really important piece of this problem of trying to open the way for bigger changes over time has to do with narrative.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, Occupy it's worth a longer discussion whether Occupy was a failure or a success. I think you're making the positive case for Occupy's success. It did sort of have this narrative or sort of gestalt impact, which maybe is attributable to the Occupy movement, although maybe not. It's a little bit hard to know. It got, but beyond that, I think it can be hard to point to any measurable outcome from it. That's my personal view, and that's to me a big waste, because we did have a moment and there was a lot of energy and attention, and then it came to very little in terms of policy or outcomes.
Oh man, I'm the optimist once again. Weird. This is starting to get weird. So speaking of economic inequality, you spent the bulk of your career at Oxfam, which, as a legacy organization, is an international development group, and traditionally has been the specialist in water and sanitation in rural communities around the world. But increasingly in recent years, Oxfam has done more domestically, right? And I think that's interesting that a group known for combating poverty elsewhere started working more on the home front here in the U.S.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting transformation for Oxfam, and I would say to some extent to sort of the anti-poverty movement internationally, in which there was a evolution of thinking in which the mission was conceived of initially as sort of charity from people who have resources and food to those who don't, and over time became a more structural analysis, and the framing of the mission became more about human rights or justice. And if the mission is around charity, then it has to be from rich to poor mostly. If it's about solidarity, it can be lateral support. But if it's human rights, then it's more of a contributory or accompaniment role or support role of people affirming and supporting and asserting their human rights. And if it's about justice, then injustice can be anywhere and everywhere. And if your mission is around justice, then the U.S. has plenty of justice issues to address. So an international organization mainly focused on problems in poor countries would have an obligation to look around more locally and see that there are pretty significant justice issues nearby that it would be hard not to begin to take on some of that agenda if your cause really is justice. So I'm describing sort of this mission transformation that happened at Oxfam, but also other development agencies, where they began to think that they need to broaden their aperture in terms of where they're paying attention, and so it's poverty, but if you conceive of poverty as a justice issue or as a human rights issue, then the problem isn't over there; it's here as well.
And here, at this point in the conversation, we are coming into sort of connection with another episode of the podcast featuring a mutual friend of ours, Angela Bruce Rayburn, because, as you say, America has a number of justice issues. It also has one in particular, the history of racism, slavery in America, that they don't call it a reckoning for nothing. We've been very slow, to put it mildly, coming around to dealing with the issues there. So to connect all of these dots, the challenge that Angela has made and pushed and made the focus of this point in her career, it's about centering on the perspectives of affected people and giving them authorship of the change agenda. I have to assume that has been part of the discussion within Oxfam. Yes?
Yes, I think so. Well, it's been part of the discussion in the whole development and anti-poverty project. The question of agency, like who is the actor? Is it the development actor, or is it the people that you're trying to support? And who should make decisions, and where should resources go? Some of it is a resource question. Who holds the dollar in the end, and where does the dollar flow from and to? And there's for example, I talked about how conceiving your mission as being one of justice or empowerment is been a lot of the flow of the transformation. But even the word empowerment now has become controversial, because the idea that one person distributes or gives power to another may be obsolete. That power is held and is recognized and supported rather than provided. So recently, I've known that agencies are starting not to use the term empowerment, because it by itself sounds patronizing or neo-colonial in its own way. So there's been a lot of self-reflection, which is quite right and appropriate within these sectors, the development and humanitarian and anti-poverty sectors, thinking about what roles we should play, who has agency, where does power lie, where does funding lie. And I think it's healthy and good, although it can also be exhausting and distracting from the core mission.
You've in your career you've managed advocacy, I guess is what I'm trying to say, right? You have internally in a major organization led advocacy and worked with colleagues. So I'm kind of opening up a very broad and open-ended area, but I just wanted to kind of take a moment and sort of talk to you from that perspective of sitting in a perch with your fingers in a lot of different advocacy work, and what one learns and what one brings to that. If that makes sense?
Yeah, I think the learning is really important. We don't, the world is not static. It doesn't sit still. Politics is not static. It doesn't sit still. You have to evolve and learn. You have to try things. You have to fail. You have to try to capture knowledge and learning from it, and then do things differently. So that's one thing, is just to see the practice as something that has room to fail, to experiment, and to learn. And rather than every effort being an existential quest, and where failure is impossible. In fact, failure is common, and we have to accept that, because we do fail a lot. But failure is a learning opportunity, and you can do better next time, and you can adjust and re-strategize. So I
on behalf of all evaluators, I thank you for that perspective, by the way.
Yeah, and I do feel like a pendulum has swung away from learning and institutionalizing learning, and I've been watching monitoring and learning departments be reduced in recent years, and it's really, for me, troubling, because if you don't learn, you're just going to repeat mistakes. And I really think that 5 to 7% of every budget should be dedicated to learning, to evaluating and measuring and learning. And so if you're not doing that, then it's not good practice. Another concept that I've always tried to apply is to be a portfolio manager, is to see your work as a series of bets, often operating at the same time, and you're kind of seeing which bets are playing out, and then you shift resources to where things are working and shift resources away from where things aren't working. And it can be a difficult and painful process to do that. But as I mentioned earlier, flexibility and opportunism in advocacy and policy, I think, is a value. And being able to try something, see it's not working, and then shift over to something else that does seem to be working, I think is an important thing. And at where I was before, we did have a broad agenda, and I could be a portfolio manager and think in those terms. I think smaller organizations or organizations with more narrow missions or goals, I think, have a harder time with that, which is fair enough. But if you can, you should be able to think in terms of portfolios, and maybe it's not different issues, it's different tactics or strategies, or different targets. They're working at the state level rather than the federal level, or working at the international level rather than the national level, or so forth. But try not to have to make one single bet at any one time. And then I think, sorry, I'm just giving you a couple observations on it, is the other one,
please, yes,
is that we are living through revolutionary times, at least organizationally. The Me Too movement, Black Lives Matter, the decolonization movement, these are all happening sort of contemporaneously, and they're all really important reflections, and they should lead to action and changes. And as a manager or a leader, it's a really tough time to try to manage your way and navigate all those different, because these are valid and really important critiques of organizations and management culture and so forth, and we need to make changes, but we also need to keep doing the work and pursue our mission. And balancing those two things has been, I think, really difficult for leaders and managers over the last few years. And I hope that these organizations come through better. But I also think some of them may not come through it, or will come through very damaged and encumbered. So sorry, I'm just giving you some reflections from my time doing this work and being in a sort of role in advocacy and policy in Washington and working internationally as well. I think these are interesting times, really, really difficult times, sometimes inspiring, but complex and requiring a lot of nuance and learning.
Those are really important points, and I'm really glad that you made them. When I talk about these things with my own daughter, who's in a related field, and we may get to have them on the podcast, the line that I keep going back to, and I don't mean it as a throwaway line, is how many things are we trying to change all at once? And truly, I don't mean for that to be offending off of some of the deeper questions. I think two things can be true. I think that there can be side by side the less the tinkering, the marginal changes alongside the important, difficult conversations. What there can't be is everything, right? Is getting wrapped around the axle of taking account of everything that's problematic. It is problematic, and it needs to be dealt with, just not everything all at once, as I said. But I think you were also making an important point, both just now and connected to earlier on. So there's the lifelong learning approach to life and just any form of work and human existence. And so there's that. But you're also talking about something a little bit different, which is how important that outlook is, particularly to politics and society, right? That the complexity of the environment that we work in and the constant change means that in order to be doing this right at all, or partially right, means being really clued into that, if I understood you correctly.
I think that's right. And I mean, one of the points I'm trying to make is that we can't suppress these social revolutions. Even if you wanted to, you can't, and you shouldn't. And so workplace culture is changing and should change. And the missions of organizations has to change to better reflect sort of our knowledge and philosophy about things. And so you can't resist it. And yet you also have to hold organizations together and deal with your donors who may not be quite where you are yet, and execute on contracts and basic stuff, that business operations. And it's a real challenge. And there's definitely sort of a generational divide where younger people in all their glory and idealism are pushing very hard for change, internal change, and changes in philosophy. And the old fuddy-duddies like me are trying to keep their trains running and keep the donors happy. And it's a really difficult situation that I think will produce a better result in the end. But it can be a painful process. I'm watching it happen all across the sectors that I work in, and it's both exciting and frustrating, and so that's I think that's one of the things I'm trying to say.
I was trying to look at it from sort of the drinking from a fire hose perspective, mm-hmm. right? Mm-hmm. But in terms of the field itself, this is probably something I should cop to, at regular intervals. As a white guy, looking back on my own career, I have to recognize that in the labor marketplace, I wasn't going up against everyone who could have been, right? That racism in America shaped the labor market supply and demand, and that I've had my career within, right? And so, like everything in a country with systemic racism, racism, of course, is what's behind the privilege of the successful career that I've had.
I like that, David. I'm glad you said it. It's me. I plus one on that. I benefited from a racist and sexist system. Well, I should say I've existed within privilege, with privilege in that system. In some ways, I don't think I've benefited from it because I think society doesn't benefit from excluding talent and creativity.
Sure.
And
bigger picture.
Organizations don't benefit. So society suffers from it. But some people in their positions within it are privileged, and I've been the same, and trying to remain open and not see change as a threat, but as a benefit to society and so forth, even if it won't benefit me personally. And it's good to try to take that approach towards it.
It's probably a great place to wrap up. When I think about this podcast, I often think in terms of, so there's the not always healthy part of how much of a careerist I have been in my life. And I want this podcast to be about the healthy part of being a careerist who reflects on the nature of this work that, I can probably speak for both of that I've loved doing.
Mm-hmm.
I was just a college reunion. It's so great what you've done, trying to make to which I have to respond how much I like doing it. Right? This is no favor. This is just such an absorbing and gratifying line of work.
Yeah, I feel the same way. I've always felt lucky and privileged and almost guilty about how much I liked my work. And whereas work for the large majority of humanity is what it sounds like. Work, it's toil and travail. It's never. I've worked hard, and sometimes it's been a pain, but it's always been an honor, really, to be able to do the work I was doing, and also interesting. So that's lucky, and like I say, it's good to take stock and feel grateful for it. It's important to do that.
As they say on TV, Gawain gets the last word. Thanks so much.
Thanks.
This is great.
Thanks.